Thank you so much. You know, I'm used to speaking at conferences full of diplomats. So this was a particular pleasure to be asked to come and speak to people who live and work in a world that is deeply unfamiliar to me. I just about understand some of the terminology that you will use on a regular basis. And so I thank you very much for this opportunity. We're going to have a long conversation at the end of my remarks where we're going to, I think, go into depth on some of the broader questions. So I wanted to open my remarks with a few reflections on what I've learned in my time in foreign policy and some of the things that I think as Europe looking outward, for that was what I did as High Representative, what Europe needs to think about as the way that it will work in the future and some of the issues that perhaps will be fundamental. And I want to do this by just picking up three themes, as I say, before we go into detail in our conversation, which reflect too the fact that if you talk to what we might call seasoned diplomats, those who have been involved or engaged in foreign policy over the years, who have a depth of knowledge and analysis, most will say to you that this is the most difficult, challenging time of their lifetime, because the number and complexity of issues that have reached the desk of foreign ministers and diplomats are greater than at any other time. Combined with the inevitable consequence of a 24-hour media, a social media, the capacity of people to turn themselves into broadcasters, to be able from the situation on the ground to actually show you on your laptop or on your phone precisely what is happening. And the undoubted too bravery of journalists who are prepared to go into places that are extremely dangerous to try and report on the plight of so many people. We see the consequences of war or famine, the dilemmas of climate change which affects villages in Pakistan or towns and cities across the world or islands in the South Pacific. We see the consequences of the spillover of war. We see the consequences not just in what happens to people in those places, but also because they try and reach us. And Europe in particular has had to tackle and deal with that in what is very, very difficult circumstances indeed. So this combination means that we are at a point where we have to reflect on how best we're going to rise to the challenges that we have and take on the fact that they are multifaceted and difficult. And I have three reflections on that. The first is, I can't think of a crisis or an issue that anybody can tackle alone. Whether it's, as I've already mentioned, the consequences of climate change, whether it's Ebola or Zika, whether it's the spilling over of conflicts from one nation state into regions, whether it's the desire for a better economic future, whether it's the consequences of famine or flood. All of these issues require us to reflect on how we are going to tackle them in the future. And collaboration of some form will be vital to that. It's true for the UK with the European Union. It's true for all countries when they reflect on what they need to do. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is how that collaboration is changing. And I would argue something that in Europe we need to think about more fully as to how we grasp the opportunity and use it. I mean by that we have well-established, deep organisations, of which the European Union is one. The UN is perhaps the biggest example, but the African Union, the Arab League, the GCC, ASEAN, other groupings of countries brought together primarily for economic reasons are beginning to take on more and more the issues of collaboration on foreign and security policy questions. And these deep organizations have the ability to use their resources not just for the immediate, but for the long term. They have the capacity to marshal the abilities of a variety of member states, whether it's United Nations or European Union or others, to work together to try and deal with those and to take that longer view, to think about what people in Afghanistan will need in 10 years, to think about, as Europe did, how to engage in Somalia for over 20 years, to be able to do things in that constant, consistent way that is so important if we are going to be able to deal with failing states, or, if we're very lucky, reverse a failed state and give it an opportunity to return to a functioning state. And if we are going to be able to deal with the aftermath of war and crisis. But something else is happening as well, which I became very aware of, which is the growth of what I will call the informal grouping. The grouping that comes together to be able to tackle a single issue at a particular time. The Friends of Libya, Syria, the Contact Group for, where amongst the group of nations or organizations who come together, there are, shall we say, unlikely allies, those who perhaps on a normal basis would not share the values and aspirations of others, but who, to tackle this one particular issue, can collaborate in ways that wouldn't normally be expected. And we are at the beginning, I think, of trying to work out how to manage that in a way that can be valuable. But it is important, and I will give you the reason that I especially think it's important, which is to do with the basis on which we did the Iran negotiations. We call it, because we're Europeans, the E3+3. It was, of course, built upon the work done by Germany, France, and Britain for many years, bringing in the 3 additional permanent members of the Security Council, China, Russia, and the United States of America. They call it the P5+1. Germany, you are the one. We call it the E3+3. It's still 6. And when in doubt, I would say the 6. But we used to sometimes argue about the logo I'd have behind me for that. But the point about that was that, for me, it was 4.5 years of my life. I joke I'll never get it back. But it was 4.5 years of negotiation, which took us right up to the last few weeks and months when my successor took over and successfully completed the role. But during that time, we worked very closely with Russia in the talks. They were a very important partner, as were all of those involved. It was not, despite what you sometimes read in the media across the Atlantic, a bilateral agreement, far from it. And everybody played their part. In that time, I can point to numerous occasions when countries were prepared to take on the job of being challenging, of being firm, of being reasonable, of being a collaborative partner with the others in trying to get to an agreement. And to give, for the Iranian counterparts, a certainty about our position. Even though within a group of 6 countries you will have a variety of positions, there was no question we stood together. You will also recall during that time that we had the Ukraine crisis, when we were taking sanctions as a European Union, and the Americans were following suit along with others, or vice versa, against Russia. And yet, in the context of the Iran negotiations, you would not have known that that was happening outside the room. And the reason was because the focus on that one specific issue was absolutely clear, and the relationship, I would argue, between the people working on that was also absolutely clear. We were able, if you like, not to leave our feelings at the door, because we were very much engaged in trying to resolve what was a terrible situation in Ukraine. But we were able to continue to try and deal with the Iran nuclear talks. And it struck me, and continues to do so, that it was a good example with so many different and complex issues to deal with, that sometimes, only sometimes, you can use a different way of working, given a specific and clear mandate to try and achieve something. Many people have said to me afterwards, you should have covered more subjects, or maybe you shouldn't. I was very clear that the mandate from the Security Council was to deal with one and only one issue, and it was not our job, nor were we the right people in many ways to tackle more than that. But the point I'm making is the capacity to create relationships to focus on a particular issue is something I think we need to think about. It does not change the need for what I call the tankers, the big, long-term, deep, fully committed, value-driven organisations that can help people in both short and long-term ways. This is not about replacing them in any way, but it is about having a few yachts that can flit about the tankers and maybe take on some issues and at least bring resolutions to some things that can then allow for the longer, deeper conversations to take place. So one of my propositions is that we have in our diplomatic toolkit to think about more and interesting ways of collaborating to try and deal with things. And as Britain moves forward, I hope close to the European Union, and certainly, as has been said, leaving the European Union but not leaving Europe, Britain will be a partner, I hope, in looking at some of those foreign policy questions and issues. The second thought that I have as a consequence of my work is perhaps something that resonates more in a financial audience than straightforward foreign policy questions, which is something I call economics meets politics. Too often when a crisis occurs, what you see is the drive for diplomats, politicians, a political solution to be found that, in a sense, allows calm and peace to return. And in the course of especially the events that took place in what became known as the Arab Spring, or the Arab uprising or awakening, or whichever phrase you might prefer, what became clear was the reality of the economics and political issues that kind of came together and underpinned what was going on. Those events that sparked in Tunisia, literally the fire, were about economics linked to politics. And when you look at the populations of that region of young people with, like every other young person, huge aspirations for their future, you see that economic issues drive the agenda for them as much as politics. We often get trapped in our thinking on issues around a crisis of this kind by thinking about the answer is to give everybody democracy. And one of the points I used to make in my travels was that I came from a country that took 700 years to get from Magna Carta to now. And only in the last 100 did people that look like me get the vote. I don't think we can expect to build true democracies in a very short period of time. I don't think it should take 700 years, by the way. But my point is that democracy is much more about the interwoven aspects of our society that provide the framework upon which we have elections. And too often in our work in foreign policy, the drive to get to elections is to fail to recognise all of the things that you need underneath that. I understand that when people are finished with, or what they hope they're finished with, any form of oppression or lack of free speech, that their ambition is to move forward as quickly as possible to a system that they recognise, however difficult democracy can be sometimes, that they recognise is the best of all options. But I would argue that we forget that elections are the cherry on the icing on the cake. They are crucial. They are crucial because they throw governments out as well as elect new ones, that they say thank you very much, goodbye, as well as, hello, come and do something with us for a few years. It keeps politicians having to think about their electorate, and most importantly, it puts people in the driving seat at a crucial point. But of itself, it relies on an informed public, and it relies on a free press, and it relies on anti-corruption, and it relies on your vote reaching the place it's supposed to go, and it relies on the capacity to organise around political parties or whatever framework is chosen. And it relies on civil society, it relies on business functioning, it relies on NGOs, it relies on all of that, this interwoven ability that sustains the democracy, that keeps the roots buried deep, so that when the wind blows and democracy does funny things, the tree does not fall over. That deep democracy is such a crucial part of how we support nations to be able to build. But it fits into, for me, how democracy works closely with economics. Investment will not come if you don't have the rule of law. Companies will not invest in your country if they can't train a workforce and they can't have stability. They will look for markets where economies are beginning to grow and flourish. They will want to find highly educated people. They will want to be sure that the contracts that they have are enforceable in a court of law that they respect and that they know will play fair. All of those phrases I have used to leaders across the world as we've tried to build this thought of economics with politics. An example of that was taking 100 chief executives to Myanmar, Burma, to meet with a government that was quite clearly going to lose the elections, and did, but which had started the process of moving Myanmar away from its past and into its future. And a country that really struggled to know how to engage with business. In the 4 or 5 visits I made, and many of you will have made that journey as well, you might recall that 5 years ago you couldn't use a credit card, there was no Wi-Fi, the electricity came and went. The roads, once you got beyond Yangon, unless you were in the 20-lane highway in Naypyidaw, were pretty ropey. It was a country really at the beginning of how to try and set itself up economically. And for many businesses, it was a country that they did not know and didn't know quite how that investment would work. And yet, without that growth and investment, that the capacity of the country to develop its own small business structure and to be able to get that inward investment, not least on technology and energy and so on, the chances of the success of the future would be lessened. And that was certainly true in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. That if you weren't able to provide an economic outlook that people could believe in time would give them the sort of future that they wanted for themselves and their families, then the political process was going to be in danger of not realizing what it could be. I met a young man in Tripoli, in Benghazi actually, in Libya, at the height of the war when I was there. And he said, having come out of Gaddafi's jails where he was for 8 years, he said, you know, it's really simple. In perfect English, of course, he said it. We want what you've got. You have your democratic way of life and you take it for granted. It is what you live with. Whereas for us and for many like us, it's something that we aspire to. So my second proposition, if you like, is that we have to think about, in the business and public policy worlds, the collaboration that is vital to resolving the bigger questions and problems that we face, which is going to be about how these different aspects of the life of a country can work together to the benefit of business because of the rule of law and the stability and capacity of people to be able to develop their nation, but also from the process of politics, which enables that to be the framework against which the future of the country can be judged. And it brings me to my third and final kind of major point of things that I think are increasingly important, which is about the nature of the comprehensive way in which we approach the problems that we face. I'm going to take you back to 2010. A long time ago it feels now. The world was a very different place. I had just become the EU's High Representative with the longest title in history. Possible to fit on a business card, but lovingly called, or I hope it was lovingly called by my colleagues, the High Rep. And the number one issue on my agenda at Christmas 2009, the beginning of 2010, was piracy off the coast of Somalia. Do you remember those days when that was our biggest problem? There were 127 attacks in 2010. 47 of them were successful. We had 400 hostages who were kept for periods of between 5 months and 3 years. 30,000 ships travelled across that piece of water that was a quarter the size of Africa. And we had, in 2010, 5,000 pirates at sea. It was a huge crisis, a crisis for business because of trade, incredible problem for the World Food Programme that could not get its food to the poorest people desperately in need of their help. And it was a problem that was exacerbated because when we did fish the pirates out of the sea, they were often 14 and 15-year-old boys who had been enticed into piracy with the prospect of $10,000 for a successful pirate attack versus $1 a day if they were lucky on the land. And when we fished them out, it became clear that the problem we were dealing with had to be solved in what I call the comprehensive approach, which is you simply can't tackle one aspect of this on its own and expect the problem to go away. Underlying causes as well as the reality of what was going on and dealing with people who are committing crimes was really important to think about together. And the reason it's not on your radar, though I noticed there were 2 attacks recently because of the famine in Somalia, I imagine, but the reason it's more or less off your radar is because we did it. And actually Europe did it with help, because again, back to point number 1, you can't do anything on your own, even if you're as big as the European Union. But we did it, and we did it by collaborating with others and creating different elements of the solution. Let me take you through them. We created a corridor using ships provided by 13 nations of the EU, together with India, China, some of the African nations, especially South Africa, NATO, who had 1 ship under Operation Ocean Shield, with countries like Australia, with Mauritius, with others, who made sure that in that corridor, if you took your ship through that corridor, you would not be attacked, because we would have the capacity to deter or get the pirates. We created a radio system that meant any ship coming anywhere near the area could tune in to a specific secret and encrypted system and listen to all reports of what was going on in the area, where they could report activity they were worried about or listen to people also reporting the same. We followed the money, using expertise around the Gulf to find out where the warlords, for that was who they really were taking the money. We provided prisons, which we built in countries where we could guarantee a reasonable quality for these young men to get rehabilitated and trained into something else and to be close to their families rather than being taken to prison a long way from home. 30%, by the way, of the prisoners in the Seychelles in that year were pirates. And here was the Seychelles, this beautiful range of islands, which I've only ever flown over, who had lost 100% of their cruise ship tourism, 100% because of piracy. We then developed the land so that we created opportunities for people at home. We worked with the African Union to get rid of Al-Shabaab, to push them back so they could no longer create terror. We helped to solve the end of the 20-year-old civil war. We brought in elements of government. We brought in security. We supported the building of the justice system. We helped a fledgling president with a big compact and long-term funding and support to be able to do it. My favourite programme of Somalia was called Give Up Your Guns and Go to School, aimed at the young kids who had either got involved in Al-Shabaab or indeed had taken to piracy. And within 3 years, piracy not completely disappeared, but dropped by over 90%. The reason I talk about that is because it has gone off the radar, because it was done. And to show that actually when you think about issues end to end and think about all of the different ways in which you need to resolve the problem, you are better able to get to good solutions. And as Europe goes forward, and when you look at all of the different areas that we need to be engaged with, not least when you think about the fact that eventually we will need to rebuild Syria, that issues around the Middle East and closer to home will need to be resolved, when we will have to find ways to support people who want to go home, and the continuing need to pump in resources and help and aid to countries that are still fragile and worrying, whether that is Somalia or Afghanistan or Iraq, or looking further afield to parts of Africa. All of this requires that longer term but comprehensive vision as well. And so thinking how to achieve all of this in a comprehensive way is going to be extremely important. My final thought to you is most things in the end need diplomacy. Sometimes it's not the answer to begin with, but in the end, conflicts end and solutions are found to problems because diplomats work together to achieve it. They don't always get a great press because a lot of it is done under the radar. A lot of it is done very quietly, actually, and a lot of it is done long term. Think about Colombia and 20 years of negotiation to reach agreement with the FARC. Think about the Iran deal, and I did 4.5 years, but that was by no means the whole of it. In Serbia and Kosovo, where I led the 2 prime ministers to an agreement, now both presidents, I notice, that took huge amounts of my time, sessions that went on for 14 hours, including, as I pointed out to them on my birthday, which was, I thought, above and beyond the call. But the point is, these are done in difficult circumstances, but with people who spend the energy and time to do it. And diplomacy needs the opportunity to work. It is soft power at its best, and that's what Europe does best, soft power. Thank you.